Over the 1901 Easter holidays, middle-aged English schoolteachers and Moberly and Eleanor Jourdain went on a tour of Paris and its environs. Both women had never been to France before and came to be utterly enthralled by the splendid architecture of the most celebrated of European capitals. While they were touring the Versailles Palace, a strange event happened that will remain in their memory for a lifetime. Having looked around the main building and explored all of its secluded corners, Miss Moberly and Miss Jourdain made their way through the famous gardens to the Petit Trianon, Marie Antoinette's favorite cottage, which was located somewhere in the vicinity of the vast palace grounds. Lacking a detailed plan, however, the Englishwomen lost their way. They soon came across two men dressed in what appeared to be 18th century costumes. The travelers mistook them for disguised servants and asked in French, "How do I get through?" The two strangers looked at them strangely and pointed somewhere forward with a simple wave of their hands. As the teacher walked a few more meters, they were crossed by a young woman and a girl who were also dressed in distinctly old-fashioned clothes. But this time in a surprisingly bad condition. However, neither of the teachers thought, "Something strange is going on," until they reached the pavilion where another company had gathered, dressed in period garb. The conversation there was in an unfamiliar French dialect, and as the women approached the Temple of Love Palace of Versailles, it was clear to them that their own appearance astonished those present. Nevertheless, one of the men behaved in a friendly manner and used gestures to direct them to the little Trianon of Marie Antoinette's cottage. Moberly and Jourdain recalled many simple details about their trip to the Petit Trianon. They walked across a small rustic bridge which crossed a tiny waterfall, then spotted a small circular building having pillars and a low surrounding wall. In addition, they passed through the French garden, part of which was walled in by trees. But once they reached their destination, the hikers were far less impressed by the building itself than by the sight of the lady who was sitting nearby, sketching in a sketchbook the edge of the forest visible in the distance. Strikingly beautiful in a tall wig and dressed in a long dress typical of 18th century aristocrats, the lady herself seemed more suited for a portrait than for the role of artist. And Moberly and Eleanor Jourdain managed to get close to the noblewoman before she turned around. They smiled affably, but the lady stared at them with horror and amazement. Only then did the Englishwomen realize that they had somehow traveled back in time. The entire walk struck both women as completely ordinary yet eerie. Moberly wrote that the stillness and oppressiveness were so unnatural. It was almost as though we were walking in a dream. But as soon as they woke up, this eerie lifelessness seemed to stir. And everything around them, both the colors and the whole world around them, returned to normal. The noble artist vanished, and in the place where she had been, a very different scene presented itself to the eyes of the Englishwomen. A contemporary guide was giving the group of women a tour of the little Trianon. Although Moberly and Eleanor Jourdain were speechless for the rest of their time in France, they still managed to agree with each other not to tell anyone about the experience for fear of ridicule. About 10 years later in 1911, when both were teaching at Oxford College, the ladies joined forces and wrote a detailed account of their unusual journey through time. When the report was published the following year, the authors even became celebrities among the local medical fraternity. By then the teachers had studied the history of Versailles Palace in detail and had changed a lot of minds before concluding that they had indeed entered the past through some sort of time shift or by passing through an invisible gate between dimensions. The year they calculated they had entered was 1789. In their opinion, the obscure gardeners were most likely the Swiss guards who were known to have guarded the court of Ludwig XVI. And the woman and girl they crossed paths with were dressed in rags that may have belonged to French peasant women living on the outskirts of the palace grounds. The lady who painted the wood was identified by them with great probability as Marie Antoinette herself. In 1908, Moberly and Jourdain found the journal of Madame Eloffe, the Queen's dressmaker. Eloffe wrote that in 1789, Marie Antoinette had few dresses made. However, that summer Eloffe made 2 green silk bodices, large white fichus, a pashmina tied over the bodice, and a slightly yellow skirt. This agrees exactly with the dress seen in 1901, Moberly reported. Sceptics, and there were many, began to scoff, insisting that the teachers had simply made up the whole story out of self-interest. These critics were quick to point out that not a single detail now in the future, in relation to the 18th century, could be verified. Moreover, since none of the available sources on the history of Versailles Palace, there is no mention of a wooden bridge spanning which crossed a tiny waterfall. This detail, essential to the whole story, seemed inconsistent with the known facts, thereby exposing the whole story as an awkward fiction by Moberly and Eleanor Jourdain. However, just then the skeptics were put to shame. Quite soon something of the most direct relevance to this so compromising of the whole story was revealed, which markedly added credibility to all the supposedly fictitious memories of English women. 9 years after their story was published, in 1920 a copy of the Versailles Palace plan, once owned by its architect, was found hidden encased in brick in the chimney stack of an old house in a nearby town. A 1783 map that showed the missing sites. The plan of Versailles Palace, hidden quite a long time ago, due to obscure precautions, had not come to people's attention for over a century. And most remarkably, the architect's plan included a wooden bridge which crossed a tiny waterfall, which, as the teachers said, they happened to cross. The bridge, pavilion, and garden all appeared exactly where Moberly and Jourdain had seen them. A simple plow connected the incident to the 1780s. Both women remembered seeing a plow on the ground near a pair of gardeners. The plain instrument only stood out after they learned in 1905 that there was no plow at the Petit Trianon. In fact, the land had not been plowed in decades. However, they read in Le Petit Trianon by Gustave Desjardins that Louis XVI kept an old plow at the Petit Trianon for years. It was sold during the French Revolution, along with the king's other belongings. Moberly and Jourdain eventually located a picture of Louis XVI's old plow in 1907, and they believed it identical to the one they saw in 1901. Unsurprisingly, here the suffering British women declared that they had finally been avenged and there was nothing to argue about now. And while the bridge episode didn't prove so convincingly that they were in the last century, at least it made it that much harder to ignore the incident itself. The Versailles Palace story remains perhaps the best-known example of scenes from the past suddenly appearing alive before the eyes of 20th century man. But it is by no means the only one. Subscribe to Boom Story and don't forget to like it if you want more incredible stories like this one. By doing this you are not only thanking the author, but also reminding the YouTube algorithm that you like videos with similar themes and that you can train the artificial intelligence to recommend you other authors who compose videos on similar topics.